All right. Good morning, everyone. It is 10:30, so we are going to go ahead and just get right into our webinar for today. Thank you all for joining, and thank you all for being flexible with the time change on this webinar. It is just for a one-time occurrence, so thank you all for being flexible again. But once again, just thank you all for joining. Welcome to our Multidisciplinary Approaches to Ending Homelessness CoC webinar series. We're excited to welcome you to our first webinar of 2026, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us and kick off the new year together. So we're just going to jump right into our agenda. There we go. So start off with just introducing myself. My name is Valeria Cervantes, and I'm here with the CoC team. And we're going to go ahead and have an informational forum or webinar training, educational um, presentation, uh, focusing on understanding the HUD continuum of care, the concepts and annual funding. So our presenter for today is Pat Leslie from Urban Initiatives, and we're very, very happy to have her here with us today and help us kick off our webinar series. But before we go into the presentation, I do want to go over just some other things. Um, and let me go on to the next slide. So just to go over briefly, um, okay, I think I switched these around, but let's go here. So just some quick housekeeping before we get into the webinar. So just please everyone make sure that your mics are muted at all times. If you do have any questions or any comments, please feel free to raise your hand and or type your question or comment in the chat, and we'll make sure to get your question or comment shared um, at the end of the presentation. So just once again, if you can all please just put your mics unmuted um, and just raise your hand or write in the chat box if you do have any questions or comments. And again, if you haven't already signed in, please sign in by typing your full name, your title, and organization into the chat box. All right, so then we'll jump back over here. So just a little bit about the webinar series. So this webinar series is an opportunity for all of us to engage with local and regional experts, learn about best practices, advocacy tools, and the resources that are available to prevent and end homelessness in our community. So for those who are maybe not able to join us today for this webinar, as well as all of our past sessions. They are being recorded and they are posted onto our website, which you can reach at is rivcohws.org. We can also send out a recap where you can easily access the link where you can find today's webinar and previous ones as well. All right, so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and go to our presenter today. So once again, the webinar focus is understanding the HUD continuum of care, an overview of core concepts and the annual CoC competition process. And Pat, I will go ahead and hand over um, the spotlight to you, and you can do your introduction and take us off with our first webinar.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. And again, thank you for inviting me to join you today, allowing me to join you, and for your flexibility in terms of the time change. That was totally my responsibility because I had a vision appointment with dilation, and I was afraid that my eyes might not be ready for the computer at 10. So I appreciate your flexibility. As introduced, I am Pat Leslie. I am a consultant with Urban Initiatives. I happen to have an MSW and a PhD in welfare policy and services. However, more importantly, I have a long time history in terms of direct practice with homelessness, residential treatment, as a service provider, as an administrator from both nonprofit and jurisdictional levels, and technical assistance for continuum of care issues. And so it's that practical aspect that I think is the most valuable. Next slide, please. So today, um, our information comes from a variety of resources. My presentations always draw on what's in the community, and you can see that today largely we're drawing on community planning, development, and training documents, HUD Act interim rules, which we're going to dive into, and then HUD Exchange and virtual binders, but other influences as well along the way. So frequently asked questions, feedback from other audiences. Next slide, please. Today's session approach is that it's an overview, a high-level overview of many topics related to the COC, and starting as though none of you know anything about the continuum of care. I apologize for that, but I like to make sure that our foundation is firm and not assume along the way. So you may find some of this sort of like, we know that, move forward. And so if you experience that, you can give me a signal that, okay, let's move on here, right? Or slow down. So the information, because it is various topics, can be overwhelming. I tend to talk fast. I tend to talk loud if I'm getting time pressed. So it doesn't help any of us learn. But please know that you can feel free to ask for breaks, ask me to change the pace, ask for clarification, and also watch for indicators of emphasis like bold or italics or information that's actually even repeated throughout the session. That will help you identify what's most important. Next slide, please. So today's purpose is to provide a basic understanding of the context and regulatory framework for the continuum of care, who are the partners in the continuum of care, the core concepts of the continuum, the annual competition cycle, the local and NOFO process, and then key components of rating and ranking processes that are pretty critical to the community. Next slide, please. In terms of HUD's priorities, so we're going to start with the context and regulatory framework, which you may find boring, but which is essential to making sure that you understand what's happening, right? It's essential to understanding the hierarchy of the rules, so that why a simple Google search for a regulation or to answer a question may lead you to an invalid conclusion, right? So next slide, please. So the major funding categories or types of funding from HUD are entitlement programs and competitive programs. Entitlement programs provide annual grants or sometimes even up to 5-year grants on a formula basis to selected cities, counties, and states. So think jurisdictions. Examples are community development block grants or emergency solution grants. Competitive programs are an opportunity for discretionary awards like the Continuum of Care Awards made through a notice of funding availability or a notice of funding opportunity. Notice that for COC, it was previously called a notice of funding availability, NOFA, and now it's a notice of funding opportunity, NOFO. Part of that has to do with the level of funding that is granted or available to be granted on a competitive basis, right? The funding opportunity has a specific number associated with it. You have to register for it every year. We'll get into that a little bit later. But the competitive programs give specific instructions within guidelines, within programmatic funding available every year. And there can be slight shifts, sometimes dramatic shifts, right? So the funding amounts for these funding categories are based on formulas, right? With a maximum allocation included based on issues such as geographic area, geocodes, population size, infrastructure features, measures of need. But then the awards themselves can be based on performance and other factors. Next slide, please. So when looking at regulations, we must understand that you have to pay close attention to details and context. And so, for example, In the first level, the statutory regulations, the statutory structures are those that are required or permitted or enacted by statute, that is legislation, think congressional order, right? An example would be the McKinney-Vento Act, the Hearth Act of 2009, the Hearth Act of 2012, and those are also associated with numbers, right? Numbers within the system. So from the US Congress, 42, overarching policy, or public laws, 112 through 141, et cetera. As you look at Hearth Act 2009 and Hearth Act 2012, you might say, oh, this is an act that was reallocated or reauthorized after 3 years. That would be an incorrect conclusion, because the Hearth Act of 2009 is the Homeless Emergency Assistance and Rapid Transition to Housing, Hearth, of 2009. But the Hearth Act of 2012 is the Helping Expedite and Advance Responsible Tribal Home Ownership Act, which is from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So the acronym Hearth is the same, but the year and who is actually publishing in terms of departments are different, and the content are very different. So can you think of another acronym or set of initials that mean something very different depending upon what context you're in? So ETA, estimated time of arrival, might be one that you see differently, or there might be a CES that's different, right? Think about something within your arena where the same initials could be more than one thing. And so you have to be careful what the context is of those. So in addition to those statutory requirements, there are various levels of statutes and rules that interrelate with each other. And so the executive order is another one. Executive orders are directives from the president or from a governor, can be a state governor, that help to manage governmental operations that have the force of law. And they are based on constitutional or statutory authority that's been given to the executive offices, right? They don't need congressional approval. They don't need legislative approval beyond that, but they can be legally challenged. And in 2025, we've seen this in action, right? Many of you have probably been confused by some of the actions that have been occurring, right? In addition to that, there are regulatory, which are departmental rules, right? Departmental regulations to ensure compliance with statutory and executive orders, right? So these are operating guidelines, such as interim rules, Office of Management and Budget circulars. And so for the Continuum of Care program, the primary regulation tied to the daily operation, daily responsibilities, is the 24 CFR 578. So that's the Title 24, the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 578. And for the Emergency Solutions Grant, that would be similar, except Section 576, right? There are other overarching rules, such as the 2 CFR 200, which are financial responsibilities and management that apply to many different programs and many different departments, and are implemented for HUD as well. But HUD will give more specifics about narrowing those or targeting how those, or describing how those are best used. Notice that I changed my language from targeting to noticing, because I attempt to, in our presentations, in our work together, to minimize the daily impact of violence and aggression in our communities. We include many aspects of aggression without even realizing it, such as, shoot me an email, send me a bullet point, right? And it minimizes that language for our community, and it may still be difficult language for many other members of our community. So I try to correct myself, and you can correct me along the way if I slip up. So in addition to those HUD department regulations or rules, right, there are program and community planning and development CPD guidelines, which are periodic program level clarifications and principles that are released by HUD and posted. And they alter or help to implement or clarify something that may be in the interim rule, the overarching rule, um, but it doesn't then get blended into the overarching rule. The overarching rule isn't then revised. And so that's one of the reasons that if you do a general Google search for 24 CFR 578, you may end up not seeing all the information you need. So for example of a CPD notice, the definition and the prioritization of chronic homelessness was in 2016. That's why you see 16-011. It means it was the 11th executive order of that year. Or CPD 17-01 from 2017, the first executive, excuse me, I just lied to you. I didn't intend to lie to you. The first guideline, CPD guideline for 2017 was major changes in terms of implementation and rules for coordinated entry system. So next slide, please. So here's what one of the overarching regulations would look like, right? And what I've done on this slide is to have you see that, oh, so this is the US code, right? So it's congressional code, right? From the 2008 edition, right? It gives you the chapter, it gives you the subchapter, it's on federally assisted programs, it tells you where to find it. But notice down the screen is that it has Executive Order number 13160, non-discrimination based on the basis of race, sex, color, national origin, etc., because that then gave further instructions about how to implement this particular regulation. Next slide, please. Those overarching rules can apply to more than one department. And again, each department can then help interpret and implement, give implementation guidelines. So the competition rules, these are specific rules. And notice that I didn't do well here. I said specific targets. That is what they're called in the rules, but specific emphases and changes that can be applied to a particular competition. So the notice of funding availability, guidelines on dedicated housing, restrictions on the use of funds, notice of funding opportunity, revise the formula nomenclature, right? And competition rules may say, oh, while the regulation allows for example, transitional housing grants, is that this year's competition will not fund them. That's an example of a competition rule. So there's also award contracts, so specific agreements for the use of funds once you've been provisionally allocated or awarded a fund, then you actually have a contract that is entered into with HUD by a legal entity to implement those and use those funds. There are mandatory versus discretionary rules, and this is an important piece to remember because the regulatory language in the rules have meaning, have specific meaning. So for example, mandatory would be when you see language in the rule that says must, the recipient must, or in order to qualify, you must, right? Or you shall do this. It's like, there's no discretion there. There's no option for you to say, never mind, I don't like that. I think we'll operate it differently. But if it says may or should or can, then it's an option, right? It is something where you can decide if that's how you wish to implement, right? And sometimes HUD will take that language and determine for everyone operating within that program what they will do, right? So then there are recipient and subrecipient types. So under the Continuum Care Program, these are units of government, right? Or jurisdictional entities, nonprofit organizations, Native and Native American tribal lands and rural area entities, and for-profits, which could be vendors, but which are not allowed to be a direct recipient or subrecipient under the continuum of care. I'm going to say now, and I'll say it again at least once more during the presentation, is that in the regulations, when it says recipient or subrecipient, it means the entity that is receiving the funds or grants from the federal government or from the department. It does not mean the recipients. It does not mean those who you are serving. It doesn't mean your clients. So anytime the rule says the recipient will, it doesn't mean that your clients will. It means that the organization that was awarded funds will. Next slide, please. So here's an example of what a CPD notice looks like. And notice where it's being distributed to. It's like, oh, to all of these folks, right? And here's the cross-reference. Here's what else it impacts. And so you'll notice that this is CPD notice 2701, right? It's in effect until it's amended, superseded, or rescinded. It was issued on January 23rd of 2017, right? It was the first CPD notice of that year, and it shows you what other things it influences. The title here shows a notice of additional requirements for a continuum of care for centralized and coordinated assessment system. So it went from 6 or 7 requirements for the continuum of care in terms of coordinated entry to 18. So although the regulation itself, the 24 CFR 578, didn't get updated at that point, these rules still went into effect. So if you just looked at the 24 CFR 578 to look at the what you needed to do, you would miss a substantial number of rules that you need to follow. So next slide, please. Here is what a Code of Federal Regulations look like, right, from the Government Printing Office. This shows you a section of a code from the Federal Register. Notice that it's formatted into columns. It's not particularly user-friendly, right? A search of the CFR can be very helpful to find updates, right? However, it's rather daunting for daily use, and reading through it is fairly tedious. Next slide, please. So gratefully, the federal department, in this case HUD, publishes an easier to read version. And this screenshot shows that this particular version of the Title 24 Housing and Urban Development 578, Part 578, was issued on April 1st of 2017. The original was from 2012. So this is an update to that, right? This offers basic requirements that have been altered by CPD notices, executive orders, other authorizations. And so this is the foundation, but it's not all you need in order to follow the rules, right? So this particular slide just shows you the cover for the 2017 update. There were also updates in 2022. Next slide, please. So when you're using the Code of Federal Regulations, right? And you'll hear me call it the Codified Federal Register as well. Reading and understanding this takes a lot of time, right? It takes attention to detail. It takes a knowledge of the context and history of the documents so that you might know, oh, I need to look and see. I seem to remember that when the Violence Against Women Act was updated, reauthorized in 2022, there were also some new requirements for HUD and other departments. So I need to look around the 2022 year to see what else changed. And some substantial things changed for HUD then. So effective use of that CFR requires preparation. It requires attention to detail. So you need to understand first how the terms are defined in that regulation, because emergency shelter or chronic may mean something different in the various regulations you use, right? You need to pay attention to what each section is describing. That's section 2. So within the information I'm reading, does it fall under a certain section? So only applies to particular actions, right? So notice the title of that section. What do the rules apply to? Does it apply to only rental assistance and not all housing assistance? Those are two different things, right? And then making sure that you also take the time and energy to look up the cross references to other sections of the regulation or to other regulations is really important to understanding what's happening. Sometimes, because it is a tedious job, because it does take time, a reference to another assurance or another regulation, like the 2 CFR Part 200, may be skipped over, right? And then when you go to implement or you have a monitoring by your COC or by HUD, they say, well, you didn't abide by this procurement rule. So that's a finding for us, right? And so making sure that you also, when it embeds something into the regulation, that you go and take a look at that section of the regulation to make sure you're understanding what it's asking for. So again, reading and understanding this takes time, attention to detail, and lots of knowledge of context and history. Fortunately, for the daily provider, the continuum of care and the collaborative applicant help stay on top of all of that. That's one of the reasons they're providing training today. Next slide, please. So we're going to now dive into key concepts and terms, right? So next slide, please. So we've been talking about the continuum of care as though everyone understands it to be the exact same thing. Well, the continuum of care language, the CoC language, actually has three major interrelated concepts to it. One is that it's the set of programs and services intended to address the needs of homeless persons. So essentially all of the folks that are participating today, right? All of the folks that are helping to resolve, helping to address homelessness, right? It's also the local infrastructure to coordinate programs and funding to resolve homelessness in the community, right? So that is your continuum of care lead agency, right? Your continuum of care leadership, right? Um, is their continuum of care membership group, right? And it also refers to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development competitive funding, which you'll sometimes hear me just call NOFO instead of CoC, so that there's a little more distinction there. But all three of those are related, and making sure that you understand that what someone is referencing when they say the CoC will, do they mean the set of programs and services? Do they mean the local infrastructure, your collaborative applicant, for example? Next slide, please. So who are the partners in this continuum of care? Is that there's one national headquarters of HUD, which may move from that building that you see on their slide. There are 10 regions, regional offices. So Los Angeles has one, for example. San Francisco has one, for example. There are 64, excuse me, that was inaccurate. There are 10 regions throughout the US, right? So there's region 9, which is our West Coast region, right? There are 64 field offices. That's what's in Los Angeles and San Francisco, right? There are between 350 and 400 continuums of care across the nation. Before the continuums of care organization started, there were literally thousands of applicants directly to HUD, and that made selection of grants and following grants fairly difficult at the federal level. So now we have a coordination of continuum of care that helps to also recognize what's needed at the local level in order to implement and address homelessness, right? Within those continuum cares, there are grantee organizations. There are more than 7,000 of them last year. These are the recipients of funds from HUD under the Continuum of Care program. It's not all of the programs like HOPWA and CDBG and ESG. That's under the Continuum of Care program. And then there are millions of people who are participating in the program, either as helpers and servants in the serving people in the Continuum of Care, or people being served by the Continuum of Care. So again, grantees are the recipients of funds. Next slide, please. Key characteristics of the continuum, you probably know this one backwards and forwards. It focuses on homelessness. It does overlap with other issues like substance use disorder, alcohol and other drug issues, mental health, domestic violence, poverty. But the continuum of care is specifically to focus on homelessness, which is why sometimes the resources need to be blended from other entities as well. It is designed to be a regional system, a community-based forum where folks get together and make decisions together to coordinate the development of the homeless response system for your area, to coordinate applications for federal funds, in this case HUD funds, but also other funds or state funds. So state HAP funds, for example, state homelessness funds. It sets local priorities and standards, responds to local concerns that may be different in urban areas versus rural areas, or in California versus Texas, and fulfills key functions identified in that interim rule, which went into play in 2012 and is slated to be updated again soon. We'll see. Next slide, please. So that's quite an interim, right? So here is a depiction of the components of the CoC system. You can see that it encompasses many different entities and groups, right? Next slide, please. And there are housing and services components embedded within that system. And so just as a brief overview, there's street outreach, which is a face-to-face interactive component, right, with people experiencing homelessness, or even sometimes at risk of homelessness, like within the educational system. The definition of homeless is different than what it is within HUD. So the prevention of homelessness, prevention or stabilization services and activities like eviction prevention, emergency financial assistance, right? To help people avoid entering the homeless housing system entirely. That prevention aspect is not funded in the CoC program. It is technically allowed for the first 2 years in a homeless youth demonstration program, but after that it's not. And so in essence, it's not funded through the CoC programs. Well, it is not funded through the CoC programs. It is funded under, for example, ESG. Emergency assistance daycare. These are services to identify and address persons' immediate needs, right? Tangible needs. Often looking at those who are unable or unwilling to accept emergency shelter services, because emergency shelter, seasonal, and bridge shelter services are another aspect of the continuum, right? For safe, secure, temporary places for folks to reside while they seek more permanent housing. Emergency shelter, again, is funded under HUD Emergency Solutions grants, but not under the continuum of care. Right. Support services only are services to homeless persons. So notice it's homeless persons not residing in housing operated by the grantee. So that's one of the nuances of the rules. It funds a whole host of things like outreaching, in linking clients to services, maybe operated independent of a building, maybe operated within a facility, as long with some caveats. Next slide, please. So continuing the different kinds of services. So safe haven. Now this is safe haven under HUD. This is not safe haven from our domestic violence victim service providers definitions. This is a form of supportive housing specifically for persons with co-occurring disorders. It was popular in HUD for a number of years, but the CoC program does not currently fund new safe haven projects. It will continue funding renewal safe haven projects, right? Transitional housing, temporary housing with various degrees of support services was one of the broadest sections of continuum of care programs a couple decades ago, has narrowed in the last several years. We'll see what happens in the future years. Transitional housing and rapid rehousing program, that joint THRRH, is actually a permanent housing project that combines transitional and rapid rehousing. One of the caveats in this is that each program, so each provider must offer both transitional housing and rapid rehousing services, and not just to rapid rehousing, not just to folks who graduate or participate in their transitional housing, but to others throughout the continuum of care. Rapid rehousing then is a form of permanent housing, short term, 2 years, tailored with assistance. And this one has more local influence on how it's designed, because the written standards that we'll address in a couple minutes dictate how that operates within your community for a large part. Rapid rehousing is, however, tenant-based rental assistance, no matter how you design it. So permanent supportive housing is, again, permanent housing with support services specifically for persons who are homeless, disabled, and have special needs in order to be stabilized and operate independent lives while in subsidized housing. Affordable housing, so PH, so not PSH, but PH, and other permanent housing for very low income or low income persons. Think of this as being affordable housing, such as Section 8 or voucher housing. So, permanent supportive housing is a version of permanent housing. Next slide, please. I should have pointed out that on this slide, or I should point out that on that slide, is that permanent participant rent says that, no, next slide is fine, thank you. That permanent rent, where it's participant rent, says each participant for whom rental assistance payments are made. Rental assistance is not the same as housing assistance. There are various brands of it. So it's important to recognize that the definition of rental assistance is different from just permanent housing assistance, right? So there are various kinds of assistance. So there's tenant-based rental assistance, sponsor-based rental assistance, and project-based rental assistance. And the names pretty much tell it all. Tenant-based means that a subsidy goes with the tenant, it's attached to the tenant and can go wherever they go within the continuum. Can even sometimes cross continuums given very select circumstances. Sponsor base is tied to the sponsor or the agency that's managing the housing, right? And project base is tied to the property. It is when assistance has been afforded to develop a property or a structure, right? And then, so the assistance is tied to only those who choose to live within that property. It can't travel with them if they decide to move to another property. Next slide, please. So here's an example of, and it will be updated here in just a second as well, an example of if the issue is a program type, right, under the CoC competitive program versus the ESG entitlement program, housing and service categories, you can see the differences between those two columns. Housing standards regulations, so housing quality standards have been the rules for the CoC program for decades. That is now changing to, right, it's now changing to the Inspire, right? I only have an hour and a half. Right, and so uh, uh, Inspire, right? And Inspire is that a guideline that operates above and beyond the Continuum of Care program, but it does not apply to the ESG program, right? And so you'll see that there's some differences there in terms of match requirements. For the Continuum of Care program, you match 25% of anything but leasing that is provided by HUD. But in the ESG program, you have to match 100% of the dollars you get. So who are eligible recipients getting funds directly from HUD under the Continuum of Care? It can be nonprofits, units of government, Continuum of Care leaders, collaborative applicants, and in the entitlement ESG program, it's jurisdictions and units of government, who then may pass down funds to nonprofits and other entities. Next slide, please. Collaborative applicant is a key, administrative entity. Let's do administrative entity first. Infrastructure can overlap between federal and state grants. And so, for example, in the Emergency Solutions Grant and in the state grants is that there's a label of an administrative entity, and that administrative entity for state grants must commit to administering the ESG in collaboration with their CoC. So sometimes the structure that's been developed by HUD for the CoC is used for other purposes as well. So if you have HAP funds in your community, which Riverside does, the CoC system is used to help implement that and receives an allocation for that. Next slide, please. So here's the collaborative applicant. Again, a key element in the structure. It is a legal entity that can enter into agreements with HUD and acts on behalf of the Continuum of Care, which often is a collection of stakeholders that are not a legal entity. They're a group. They're a membership group. Next slide, please. Is the CoC board. The CoC board is a group that is designated by the CoC to provide oversight and governance on behalf of the CoC. It's done through a charter. The board's responsibilities are defined by the charter and described in the charter. It must be a representative of the relevant organizations in your CoC. So your board has certain, often has certain seats or designations, and it must, by regulation, contain at least one homeless or formerly homeless individual. Okay? It's important to understand that the CoC itself, that larger entity, that larger group of stakeholders and collaborative applicant, remain responsible for all of the rules in the 24 CFR Part 578, even if they've delegated it down to the board or another component of its structure, is that the CoC is responsible even if they've said, oh, we'll have the board do this, right? They remain responsible to HUD for implementation. Next slide, please. So the HMIS is something you are probably quite familiar with. It is the local information system, right? It is the local repository of information. It's used to gather information, to provide reports to HUD, et cetera, to help identify what's needed in your community. And it's important to note that victim service providers, legal victim service providers, use a comparable system with enhanced protections that is the equivalent of the HMIS, but not direct client level identified data into the HMIS. Next slide, please. The coordinated entry system is a more recent feature of the continuum of care. It's a process developed for people in housing crisis to help prioritize and identify who needs what kind of housing, to match it so that the implementation of CES helps to effectively distribute resources in your community. It is implemented through a set of standards that you develop locally and must comply with that 1701 CPD notice with all of those requirements, right? In history, in the documentation, in the regulations, you may see this being referred to as the centralized as opposed to coordinated entry system as well. Next slide, please. Again, this is the project applicant, a recipient. This is the organization who's eligible to apply for projects under a funding opportunity. In Riverside, the collaborative applicant, the County of Riverside, HWS, is the applicant, is the recipient, and any of the entities that are implementing the programs with them, projects with them, are subrecipients to them. Important to note that. So, this is important to note that the project requests support, submits and requests supporting documents, right? The collaborative applicant looks at the project applications, the project requests, the project intents from your subrecipient agency, your organizations in the community, and then determines who they will partner with along the way. Next slide, please. So another key part of infrastructure is the eSNAP system. I think I maybe skipped one. Let's do this. Written standards. Written standards are required for each CoC. It gives the guidance and explanation for how things are going to be implemented. It is coordinated with ESG. It documents your local priorities, and it is where you identify how you're going to operate your rapid rehousing program. Will it be a flat subsidy? Will it be for 3 months only? Will it be a graduated program? Will participants in rapid rehousing contribute to rent or not? Because rapid rehousing does not require, regulations do not require rapid rehousing participants to participate in rent unless your local written standard says that it will, and most do. Right? Actually, your written standards for rapid rehousing are very flexible and very designed to support consumers, your participants, your clients, right? The governance charter is a formal document required by the regulations. It defines how responsibilities are assigned within the COC because, again, the COC is often not a legal entity. Having a group of 200 people or 100 people try and make decisions together is awkward and inefficient. And so quite often, a governance charter will identify not only a board that must be seated, but what the board will be responsible for or what subcommittees will be responsible for. That guide has to be reviewed annually by your collaborative applicant, your HMIS lead, and your CES system. It has to be updated every 5 years for selection of the board. That doesn't mean that your board remains in place for 5 years. It means the process for selecting them is in place for 5 years, unless it happens to be updated through the annual review process. Next slide, please. I know this is a lot of background. Sorry. ESAPS, Electronic Special Needs Assistance Program portal. It's where you submit your applications to HUD. It is used for preparing. It's used for prioritization. It also contains required reports, right, for tracking grants, etc. It is a historic system that is a blend of technology, old linear technology and new interactive technology, which makes the system pretty challenging. But you can't apply for COC funds without it, right? And so that is a key component of understanding. And quite often we provide support services to folks who are just learning the eSNAP system because there are some unknown, undocumented, not very transparent pieces of it that will help you in the process. Next slide, please. The HMIS system is that system, that data repository that you're familiar with. It is HUD-funded. Programs are required to participate in it unless it's a qualified domestic violence service provider who participates in an alternate system. It is also the foundation for the state HDIS system. So the state takes some information from HMIS for their system. Next slide, please. The LOC system, line of credit control system, right, is primarily the grant distribution system. Once your award is signed and implemented by HUD and you as the grantee, or in this case, Riverside as the grantee, a line of credit is actually transferred to your bank, right, based on the budget. And that is how funds are drawn down, is through the line of credit control system. It has very specific user and access to it. So if you have a change in leadership, particularly a change in the persons who have rights to assign or draw down funds from the LOC system, it's very important that you track that change in leadership and update it in the LOC system. It takes a little while to do it. It's not like, oh, let me do this today. It takes often 2 weeks to sometimes several months for that update to occur, depending upon your situation. The project and award numbers, this is something that if you learn, can be really helpful to you, right? There's a project application number. It's a 6-digit number. It's assigned in eSNAPs when you first apply. But the project unique identifier is the first 4 digits that are permanently assigned to a project, and it's part of your award number. So the award number starts with the state, right? It's a 15-digit number, starts with state. So ours all start with CA, right? Then followed by the project ID number. So by those 4 digits that recognize your project. And then by the funding code, what element was it funded under? Was it a domestic violence bonus fund, for example? Then the field office and region number, so ours will say 9. The COC number, right, which is embedded and in the award number, right? And then the award year and the number of renewals that have been implemented. So that whole long string gives you lots of information. So when you ask HUD about, can I do X, Y, and Z, they will either ask you for your project number or quite often ask for your award number if you're looking to make a change, because that award the rules of that award stay with that award until it expires. Next slide, please. So what are the responsibilities of the continuum of care? You might even see sometimes say, oh, the board has these responsibilities. The continuum of care has the responsibilities for all of those things identified on this slide, and they can indeed designate or establish policies to establish board authority to take action without coming back to them, right? But they are responsible for governance, for identifying the COC geography, for selecting the collaborative applicant and the HMSC lead, all of those things, right? And the collaborative applicant is the entity that submits the application. They are that entity. They are the only entity that can apply for planning dollars from the HUD for COC, but it's done under the umbrella of the responsibilities of the COC, who typically also then for this competitive process establishes a subcommittee or a rating and ranking group, right? So next slide, please. What are some of the coordinated relationships then? Congress holds headquarters responsible for its rules, right? Headquarters then requires the COCs to take on certain kinds of roles and responsibilities. The COC selects the board and collaborative applicant to fulfill key roles and to act as legal, the collaborative applicant to act as the legal entity. The collaborative applicant then partners with all of you, HWS, right? And then agencies work together with unsheltered persons to make sure that homelessness is addressed. But the success of the performance of the agencies in the COC is critical all the way up the line to being able to receive funds. And so as we look at then what happens in the continuum of care application process, which we're coming to, it's important to remember that all of this fits together. One piece, the rest, the success of an agency, the success of the agencies working together, all build to what comes to your community for funds. So next slide, please. Deep breath. One stretch break here as we head into the last sections here. So, you know, roll your head and your neck, right? Limber your arms, tense and relax your shoulders. Do something that helps you breathe, reorient yourself, and get ready for the next deluge of information. So, okay, next slide, please. So now it's the annual funding process, something you may be critically interested in. Next slide, please. This is what the annual funding process looks like in terms of the COC journey. Notice that it has multiple partners and pathways. You see that it has all of those partners that we identified. It has applicants, right? And there are many components of it. Next slide, please. So key concepts in the funding cycle are, first of all, the registration of the COC itself, right? The collaborative applicant on behalf of the COC for the annual cycle. And actually, this is to happen by regulation, happens the second Tuesday of January. So it would be happening for the 2026 year next Tuesday on the 13th. We are still working on the 2024-25 year right now, but that's the first step, is registration of the COC for the competition. Then there's a grant inventory worksheet. It's a list of all the projects that are eligible for renewal in a given year. Typically comes in May or June. HUD produces it, sends it to the local community confirms it. And once it's confirmed, it becomes the basis for a lot of funding allocations. The preliminary pro rata share is an amount generated by a formula tied to the jurisdictions within the COC. It's typically less than your annual renewal demand amount. The preliminary pro rata share is announced in May or June, typically soon after the grant inventory worksheet. The annual renewal amount, however, is the amount that's needed to support each eligible renewal for 1 year, and that's often confirmed in June or July. Next slide, please, as it was this last year. In the funding cycle, we also need to pay attention to the fact that the dollars that are allocated, from HUD are divided into tiers, must divide it into tiers. So think of them as top one priority and secondary priority, right? Top one tier, a portion of your annual renewal demand is placed into tier one by HUD. You can only place the number of projects with dollar values into tier one that fit into that tier. Everything else has to go into tier two, which has a balance of your annual renewal demand funds and bonus funds that you can compete for. And in tier one, each continuum of care is competing against other continuums of care. In tier two, each project that's in tier two competes against every other project across the nation based on a separate formula. So tier one, sometimes we say, is a little more secured as long as your continuum of care is performing well, following the rules and performing well. Tier two is more at risk because you're competing with a much larger group of entities, right? So think about it. 350 to 400 continuums compete in tier one. 7,000 applicants compete in tier two. Next slide, please. Local rating and ranking process. It is, you have to, by HUD regulation, you have to have a local rating and ranking that considers what projects will be considered for inclusion, what projects will not be, and what their allocations will be. There's then a CoC scoring and federal ranking, which we discussed. That's how they determine who is successful in tier one, right? So your CoC writes an application in addition to each project writing an application. Your consolidated CoC application is a main component of the CoC application that describes your regional performance, right? Processes, entities, policies, etc. There's then a priority listing. It is compiled by your collaborative applicant. It takes the results of your local rating and ranking process and puts them in priority order and tells HUD what kind of funding you're asking for that project, right? In the old language, if you've been around for a long time, that consolidated CoC application used to be called Exhibit 1. Next slide, please. So then, what are the processes within the local CoC competition cycle, right? So next slide, please. The competitive process, you can see the national office's responsibilities. In the middle is the continuum of care responsibilities. You see the LA field office influence in there. And then the bottom row are the local grantees and subrecipients or units of government. It's a fairly complex process, right, that has some flow back and forth. And so the collaborative applicant, your HWS, helps to facilitate this whole thing, is responsible for facilitating this whole thing. Next slide, please. So general steps in the process in preparing for the NOFO. Note that there are some details that will differ for each type of project or each type of partner. So just know that this is the overview, right? So the CoC registration happens, then there's a determination of available funds. It's based on the grant inventory worksheet for verification for annual renewal demand. There's an announcement of the NOFO, the annual NOFO by HUD, and the guidelines, and that will establish your annual renewal demand, your tier one and tier two funding levels, any bonus funds available. The agencies then, once that's released, the agencies then register in eSNAPs for the same funding competition. They can't register for the funding opportunity if the CoC has not. So the CoC registers first within eSNAPs, and then later on, the individual agency must register in eSNAPs for that opportunity in order to submit an application, a project application. Next slide, please. Major steps in the process are a local review, your local CoC through your collaborative applicant must develop a rating and ranking tool to do all of those assurances that are in there. Ensure you're meeting eligibility thresholds, making sure you meet quality thresholds for the competition, assessing renewal performance, because the regulations say that the continuum of care is responsible for reviewing the performance of recipients, of grantees, and taking action against, and that's what it says, taking action against those entities if they're not performing well. It is a federal requirement for your continuum of care to look at reallocating funds if a project is not performing well. So HWS is doing their job when they say, I think we're going to reallocate some funds here, right? Or we need to look for different subrecipients. That's all required, right? So you also need to align with HUD and COC priorities for that year. We saw some changes this year that we're still in decision making with. And then it also needs to be populated with data, right? It's data driven from HMIS, annual performance reports, CES, financial records, et cetera. And then the preparation of applications, there are two levels, the project level and the COC level. Again, the documents have to be prepared and submitted in eSnaps. The collaborative applicant rates and ranks them in the priority listing, and the COC or board provides authorization to the collaborative applicant to submit. And again, only the collaborative applicant can submit on behalf of the COC. Next slide, please. We said details differ for each type of partner. So collaborative applicant and HMIS lead have slightly different eligibility requirements and threshold requirements, as do grantees and subrecipients. There are some funds that are restricted to youth homeless demonstration projects, which you all have, for DV bonus projects and for planning grants. Planning grant can only be awarded to the collaborative applicant. And then bonus funds each year describe what's allowed. The local rating and ranking process is a group without conflict of interest that uses the tool that has been developed to do all of those things that you just looked at, conducting those threshold reviews, conducting project eligibility and quality review, looking at the conduct of, looking at the applicant and subrecipient capacity. Have they drawn down funds? Have they used their funds? All of those things. Have funds returned to HUD each year, right? What is the alignment with the continuum of care need and with the board or HUD priorities or continuum of care priorities, right? And it has to be a publicly transparent process where the collaborative applicant posts public notices per a HUD schedule. So for example, the HUD schedule will say at least 30 days in advance of the due date to HUD, your continuum of care must request that all applications, project level applications, are received by the collaborative applicant at least 30 days in advance of the HUD due date. And then at least 15 days in advance of the due date, so now just 15 days later, right, that the local COC rating and ranking collaborative applicant process for prioritization must be completed, and applicants must be advised outside of eSnaps if they're going to be funded or not, right? So, and then at least 2 days in advance of the continuum of care HUD due date, you must have all sections of your regional application posted in a public way, right? And so, although it may sound like you have 70 days for an application, right? It's that when you break down all of the local and ranking requirements, it might only be 30 days, right? So next slide, please. So making sure you're ready for documents to be submitted in eSnaps, making sure that the HUD then HUD will review and score the regional continuum and rank it, and will review the projects to make sure that they're eligible. Renewal projects are typically determined eligible, but may not meet quality standards if they haven't performed well. So renewals are relatively safe in terms of eligibility, unless that particular NOFO has changed something. Next slide, please. And we've already said, here are some collaborative applicant responsibilities. We've woven that into some of the other slides. But again and again, has to ensure the transparency of the process and must ensure the responsibilities of the HMIS and CES systems are provided. Now, they can do that by directly performing them or by creating a relationship with another entity to perform them and then review them, assess them, and implement corrective action as necessary. Next slide, please. What can happen to maximize success? To enhance the strength of that application, right? Where you've got all of those different variables acting together, is that performance monitoring. When your housing and welfare service, housing and work systems, HWS, comes to perform monitoring, it's a benefit to the continuum of care. And while you may feel anxious about it, right, that performance monitoring gives an opportunity for corrective action and for strengthening the performance of the system before HUD looks at it and says, this is how you performed last year, too late to do anything about it, right? It's also a way to seek additional resources through the collaborative applicant or the continuum of care and your broad partnerships. It can, the continuum of care and collaborative applicant can provide additional support that's not required by HUD, like ongoing feedback, like your whole system of trainings, right? Can provide point in time reports and dashboards for public use, right? Or for agency use, and can provide training, technical assistance, and communication to assist stakeholders in understanding this whole complex process. Next slide, please. So the 24-25 NOFO has been unusual. We are not done yet. In fact, we're only partway through the process. I was going to say we've just barely started, but that's not quite true. The hierarchy of federal regulation structures have impacted this year's NOFO with new HUD guidance and with executive orders. In the 24-25 NOFO, which was the last one that your continuum processed, there were 90% of the funds in tier one, and all of those factors labeled in the second paragraph, second section of here, right? It maintained historic eligibility and project quality threshold, continued the same types of programs for funding. And then between November 13th and today, there's been a series of changes and announcements from HUD, along with a series of, remember we said that executive orders can be challenged by legal action. So the departmental orders have been challenged by legal action, and I was going to say every week, but it's not quite every week, but periodically between November 13th and today, there have been orders from the court that have influenced what the NOFO for this year looks like and will contain. As we sit right now, yesterday, the order for understanding and posting the NOFO application had been ordered for January 6th yesterday. And then in the morning yesterday, both HUD and the plaintiffs, which are the National Alliance to End Homelessness in several states, including the state of Washington and many others, agreed that they needed an additional day to review what was being proposed. And so now the due date for that is January 8th to the court. So we're hoping that by late in the day tomorrow or the following day, we will see the release of a NOFO for the 2025 year. So for renewals and potentially new projects. Next slide, please. So there are lots of frequently asked questions, and I have a couple of typical slides of them, but rather than taking the time to look at what others have asked, I'd like to open up our last almost 20 minutes for your opportunities to ask questions, to make comments, to ask for clarification, to provide feedback. And if you don't have a lot of questions, we will go back and look at some of these frequently asked questions just to make sure we're on the same wavelength. So questions, comments. Do we have questions in the chat? I haven't been following it, so let me see.
As of right now, I don't see any questions on in the chat, but maybe we just allow for a minute or so to let some
Certainly,
individuals
and
process, yeah, all this.
yeah, and raise of hands works well. I mean, it was a lot of information on various levels. So, and it was a talking head. We didn't get to do interactive pieces. So while you're thinking, I will say quite often we're asked, well, who sets the COC priorities? When are those set? And people will say, oh, after the NOFO. Well, it's actually recommended that the goals for funding, which are tied to HUD goals and priorities, which are in a 5-year plan, and to make the effective use of available funds, these should be data driven, and they should actually be set as much in advance as possible. So what is it that your local community needs? What are your gaps in your system? What are the priorities from HUD that are reflected in your system? And then looking at, oh, we know that this is a priority for our community. How does this fit together with this year's NOFO? Right? So when do agencies speak into the process? Before the NOFO is released, right? Is that when you're looking at what your local needs are, rather than being driven by what the NOFO says for this year, and I'm going to call it chasing the dollar for a minute, um, looking at what your community looks like and understanding what it needs and what you're experiencing throughout the year um, is important. And it helps to develop a community wide system perspective rather than one that executives for your agency have to pay attention to, which is what does this mean for my organization, right? The continuum of care is responsible for looking for what the community wide system needs and setting priorities based on that. Questions, comments? Did I put you to sleep? Is it like way overwhelming? Next slide. So we'll just take a look at a couple. Is it next slide, please? So what goes into ranking? Eligibility thresholds, quality project thresholds, data-driven criteria, performance on key measures, and sometimes, like in the more recent NOFOs, there's been a whole lot of points on the continuum of care application, that regional application, tied to performance measures that have already occurred. And there's not much you can do about it. If you didn't make the threshold, if you didn't make the benchmark, you won't get those points. And sometimes out of 100 points, or let's say out of 200 points, it could be as many as 45 points that are tied to those performance measures that if you haven't made them, you can't get them. And again, that scoring of your continuum wide regional application impacts every project that's in tier 2 because 50% of the score in tier 2 is tied to whatever score you got for your continuum of care application, right? So who has the final say? The membership or the board, or it could even be the collaborative applicant if the COC membership delegated that to the rating and ranking group, to HWS, or to the board, for example. Next slide. So I'm not hearing questions and comments, so I will take this opportunity to say a couple more words about eSNAPs because it is a challenge, right? Um, eSNAPs, that electronic special needs assistance programs portal, which is where you apply for your continuum of care application, has a left-hand menu, which is a linear menu, right? But parts of that linear menu have now been embedded into the actual project application. This is particularly tricky for Riverside because Riverside, as the county, is the applicant for, is the grantee for all of your continuum of care projects. And so in the eSNAPS portal, there's something called the applicant profile. That applicant profile for Riverside is completed by HWS, right? And and that then will import into the project level applications that you create. You'll be going, oh, no, no, no. Your executive might say, that's not our information. Our agency's name is blah, 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 blah. And this is not our correct, uh, uh, unique entity identifier out of the special needs assistance system of awards management, SAMS. It's like, this is wrong. We need to change it. And you'll go to edit it and it won't edit, right? It won't edit it because it imports from another section of the application. So in your community, the applicant profile flows in from work that is done by the county HWS, right? And then when that section's done, in order to see the questions, when you first, if you're new to eSNAPS, when you first open it, you'll say, oh, this application is not bad at all. I open it up and it has a section 1 and it has letters A through K, and then we're done. This is great. You will only see letters A through K until the applicant assurances are completed. And so again, HWS works with you to ensure that the applicant assurances are completed, but those applicant assurances also flow to you, the subrecipient. So while they are check the box and say, yes, we agree, and that HWS as the applicant has to do that first, all of the subrecipients, all of the project level applicants, subrecipients need to pay attention because you also need to abide by those same rules, right? And then once that section is completed, that A through K, then the rest of the project questions appear. And that's where you as the applicant put your agency information, right? And where you put your design, project design, unless it's a renewal, and renewals are typically imported and amended by agreement or discussion with the collaborative applicant and your agency. So just know that eSNAPS is a little tricky. It does have some sections that are interactive. You can't edit the applicant profile unless you go to the summary and then go backwards. It's kind of crazy. And you can't use the typical procedures to maneuver within the application. So if you're on, websites all the time and you're used to, click here for this icon or click there for that icon, you don't do that in the eSNAP system. You use the eSNAPs icons only to move throughout or move back or open or close the system. Because if you use the typical icons that you use for any other website, it will shut you out. It will shut you out and may or may not save what you've received. And it will say, sorry, start again. It will say, you've been logged out of the system, right? It will create chaos. Also, if you happen to be a midnight worker, right? Not recommending that, but if you happen to be, if you're on deadline and you happen to be, HUD does shut down the eSNAP system to perform updates overnight that can happen anytime between midnight and 2 a.m. our time. And if you happen to be in the system when that happens and you continue to work, it will not save any of that additional work after HUD started the reset. So just know that if you're a late night worker, you might want to say, 11:59 p.m., that's it. I'm going to bed, right? I'm done for the day, because your work may not be saved if HUD performs this update. So those are just simple hints about the use of eSNAPs. If you're new to HUD, if you're new to eSNAPs, you feel free to look at all of the support that the Continuum of Care offers you along the way. So seeing no questions or comments, we will get ready to close. However, I can tell you as a teacher, as a retired teacher, that when I don't get questions and comments, it typically means that A, the information was overwhelming and not graspable. B, it was totally already known and boring. C, it was way too long and so not helpful. Or it was overwhelming and not understandable until you get a chance to digest it or try to use it and then discover, wait, what did she say about, oh, within the CFR, I need to pay attention to what section I'm in. So it may have rules for leasing versus rental assistance. And the rules for leasing, although it's another kind of housing assistance, is not the same as rental assistance, right? And that while a CFR might say, uh, this is what happens if someone wants to leave the continuum of care and take their rental assistance with them, that has been updated. The section on VAWA has been updated. And so the original document wasn't edited, but the subsequent CPD notices and even frequently asked questions have altered the meaning. And so just pay really close attention to that CFR. And again, your collaborative applicant is really very much on top of looking at regulations, trying to discern what's happening in any situation. And I will say that your finance department does a stellar job. They do a stellar job of protecting the community and the continuum of care and ensuring that the financial requirements are followed so that you don't lose the money. Because if you lose annual renewal demand money, renewal monies, it's lost permanently. So it's not just that 1 year, it's for every following year. So it can mean millions of dollars. So thank you for your time and attention. I apologize uh, for it being a talking head. Um, but I appreciate your time and attention, and we remain available to your continuum for support and for clarification.
Thank you, Pat. I do see some thank yous in the chat, and I did see a comment from Natalis that shared a link. Natalis, if you're still on, if you want to quickly go over that, um,
Well,
just
I just
so.
want to say thank you to Pat for going through so much information. It's a lot that you covered. Thank you so much. And since Pat mentioned about the COC priorities, and I went ahead to put the link to our 5-year homeless action plan, yeah, that the county has put together. And also at the end of each year in the COC meeting, we also reported progress, yeah, of like how we are working toward these 5-year action plan. Yeah, so I put the link there, and so that you guys can take your time to review it, and also like we have on purpose put in a lot of links in the in this PowerPoint, and because like the 24 CFR, yeah, like it's kind of like our Bible, yeah, and then a lot of information there, and there's no way anyone can absorb all the information in one setting. So once Valeria has put it on our website and turn it into a PDF, and those links will be available to you. Feel free to refer to them as much as possible. Yeah, so I see that Rashana has a hand up.
Thank you, Natalis. Good morning still, everyone. Rashana Walker here with Office of Homeless Services. I just want to thank again, like Natalis said, thank Pat for providing this webinar and this information to all of you. As you may or may have known, and Pat kind of touched on it, we had an RFI that was released back in December. However, we had to pivot based on what HUD is going through right now. But at that time, we noticed a lot of new organizations that had an interest. So please, please, please refer back to this webinar um, for the next time that a local competition will be released. So this information was very informative. And for any new organizations that are interested in receiving HUD funding, please refer to this webinar. And as Natalia said, feel free to click on the links once you receive it. That was all. I'll hand it back over to you, Val.
Thank you, Rashana and Natalis. And as they shared, this webinar recording and these slides are going to be available, and we'll share up a recap link later on today, so you have access to that information as well as the links to the documents that Natalis mentioned, so you guys would be able to easily access that information. But if for whatever reason you do have just a question that you want to reach out to us, you can reach out to us at the coc@rivcore.org email, and we'll get your question answered. And then also, I know Pat, you mentioned um, not seeing a lot of questions right now, but it was a lot of information, and so maybe there are a lot of individuals on the call that are still processing the information that was shared today. And so if any question comes up for Pat later on today or even throughout the week, please feel free to reach out to us again at the coc@rivco.org email, and we'll make sure to get that question or comment responded to, so that you all have your or clarity on any information that was presented today. So again, thank you so much, Pat, for joining. We really do appreciate you taking the time to put this together and to present to our community partners, and for helping us kick off our webinar this year. And for everyone for joining today, we really do appreciate your presence today. And hopefully we'll be able to see you guys all next month. February, the next webinar will be February 4th, and it will resume at its regular time, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., unless otherwise noted or shared. But just thank you all again for joining on today. And Pat, thank you again. I can't express enough gratitude for you joining on and sharing your expertise to our community partners.
I do have a challenge for all of you, though. As you think through this in the next week or so, will you note at least one thing you learned today? It will help me feel better if you recognize, oh, yeah, I learned at least one thing today, right? So thank you for your time and for your attention and for being willing to partner. I really appreciate it. Have a good month.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. Thank you, everyone, again for joining on. And again, I'll follow up with the recap and links to today's slides and links or additional resources, hopefully by end of today. Thank you again, and hopefully everybody enjoys the rest of today and the rest of the month, like Pat said. See you guys next month.
Thank you.